emotional literacy skills, which I've already sort of introduced. But I think I put this one in here because I think this is like kids go to school and they learn their academic skills, like their reading, their writing, etc., their maths. And I think I think what's becoming more and more obvious is that kids also need to, when they go to their preschool and they go to school, also learn their social emotional skills as well. Like that's such an important domain. And I think we're doing a better job at giving kids that foundation, but still not, nearly as much focus as maybe we need in the early years. Because I don't remember ever being like directly instructed around what feelings were, how to manage feelings, where feelings felt in my body, all of that stuff. You sort of just by osmosis, I guess, reading, whatever, absorb some of this stuff. So I think we can be quite intentional about teaching kids about feelings, and recognizing that emotional literacy is a skill that can be developed. Yes, we all come to the table with more or less, for lack of a sort of more validated term, emotional intelligence. But that's not just this static thing that's just stuck. We can sort of really sort of try and upskill kids in the various building blocks that go into being an emotionally literate human being, right? So like I said before, definition wise, emotional literacy is like, I guess, being able to identify, recognize emotions, understand emotions, linking them to context, all of that stuff, understand where they come from, and then respond appropriately to emotions. And this is both our own emotions, but also the emotions of other people. That's often at the heart of good conflict resolution and healthy sort of communicative relationships with other people, right? Emotional literacy is at the heart of all of that. I'm pretty sure you can guess what the benefits of emotional literacy are, but at its heart, it's helping kids understand their own others' emotions. It's providing them with the vocab to communicate about experiences that they've had. So in that sort of the example we had before of doing that debrief the day after about what had happened, if that child has at their disposal lots of sort of language and vocab, words around what they're experiencing in the moment, and then have the words to link what that experience was like, why it happened, what happened sort of around them, you're so much more able to communicate about your own experiences and come up with solutions, or understand the impacts or the consequences on yourself and other people through that. So like important for that reason. Kids who are more emotionally literate are better socially and academically, and they are less impulsive and less aggressive. So we know that there's this association across time between being emotionally literate and having good outcomes. So that time we thought about, or I got you to think about, where you use negative talk with a kid, right? Where you were harsh with them, sarcastic with them, sassy with them, whatever. What was happening for you emotionally? And again, this is just for some internal reflection. So I don't know if you're doing it or not. We don't have to share. But I think it's important for us to recognize that even as adults, we have oftentimes these big feelings, and our feelings don't come from nowhere. Our feelings are driven by the way that we interpret events, by images that flash into our mind. So when a kid, for example, who we would expect to be empathetic in a particular situation, another kid's been injured, and we see that kid laugh in response to another kid's injury, the way that we interpret that being like, oh my God, what is wrong with that kid? That kid is so unkind. That kid's a little psychopath. Like the way that we're thinking then will lead to particular feelings. So if we have that type of thought, we might experience things like resentment towards that kid, dislike of that kid, frustration towards that kid, dismissal of that kid, whatever the feelings are. If we're in that same situation and we interpret that as like, God, that kid really struggles with empathy, I wonder what's happening for them. I wonder why they're not emotionally connecting. the interpretation, like I wonder if something happened in their childhood that meant that that stops them from emotionally connecting. That way of interpreting the situation, that way of thinking about it may lead to different feelings. We may be curious, we may be sympathetic, we may be neutral towards them, whatever. I'm just using that example to show, not as a like you shouldn't think this X, Y, and Z way about kids, but more that idea of the way that we interpret, the way that we respond in our thoughts, in our cognitions to a situation will impact how we feel, which is really important because how we feel will often direct then what we do. Do we reject that kid? Do we lean into that kid? Do we have that conversation with that kid? Are we punitive with that kid? All of those sorts of responses are driven by our thoughts and feelings in response to a child or a particular situation. And this is across the board of all of our lives, right? Not just when we're talking about students. So when we use negative talk, that's a behavior. But what we can try and do is understand the feelings that drove that behavior and the types of thoughts that drove that feeling, right? And we can understand why we reacted in that particular way. So we all, to a more or lesser degree, have emotional literacy. And if you're able to sort of break down that particular situation and think, I was feeling this way, and put labels on the feelings, and maybe I was feeling that way because I was thinking about the kid in this particular way, you may have a higher level of emotional literacy, right? If you struggle with that, maybe, emotional literacy is also something you can chip away at as a skill. And the way that we do that is by scaffolding for our kids, but then also, I do this work with adults as well. The first thing is we need to build an emotional literacy, an emotional vocab, basically. We need the words there. We need to recognize that feelings aren't just on or off, but they start small and can grow even if it feels like 0 to 100. That our body gives us clues about what we're feeling, and that we can we can start to understand and recognize when our bodies are giving us the clues that we may need to use some sort of coping strategy. So very quickly moving through those, this is a non-exhaustive list of emotional vocab words that go across sort of different domains of feelings. We've all seen sort of the feelings lists and feelings charts and circles and all of that stuff. That's really helpful. And the reason why it's helpful to have lots of words is because we can become more and more precise in describing our emotional experiences. It didn't frustrate me. I wasn't angry. I was annoyed. It's a niggly feeling. It bothered me. It annoyed me, right? I can be more precise in describing how I felt in a particular situation. The way that we can build an emotional vocab is by modeling it. We use the words as we spoke about, and I heard in the break, kids will take on our words, our phrases, our ways of describing things. We obviously can link pictures of faces with words, feelings words with labels of emotions. We can make, collages together. We can sort of draw attention to particular parts of the faces that show us how somebody is feeling and give them that emotion word. There are lots of different apps and games now that are geared towards improving emotion vocab. So in terms of emotions occurring at different intensities, the classic, right? The volcano, using the volcano analogy to describe how anger can build and how it's often too late once we get to the exploding stage to do anything about it. But this is true across all emotions as well. It's just, I think, the most commonly used with anger. Angry, it's like a volcano. We start to rumble, we get frustrated, we feel warm, we sweat, we get red-faced, and we have trouble thinking clearly. If we don't cool down, we rumble more and more, we get close to the hot zone, we get angry and angrier. It's like the lava rising to the top of the surface, and then we might explode, which looks like shouting, screaming, crying, hitting others, being aggressive, and upsetting others. But the consequences of this, for ourselves, it doesn't feel good, and for others, it doesn't impact them well as well. So this is an example of me doing this with one of my PCIT kids. This was her specific volcano analogy, her specific clues. When she rumbled, she would think to herself, this is so unfair. And that would often be the thought. She was a bit older. She was 7, so she was able to think about her own thinking, which with a 5-year-old may be more difficult to do. Might be just more body clues rather than thought clues. And then what would happen when she'd rumble is her body would become tight and she'd clench her fists and her teeth and she'd stop speaking and start breathing very heavily. And once she exploded, she would hit, scream, yell, cry, cross her arms and say mean words, right? And then when we did consequences, she was pretty insightful. At school, she'd get given a paper. She'd have to write a report of what happened. At home, she'd have to go to her room. She'd get in trouble. She'd feel sad and angry, which would make her want to explode again. So she recognized that this cycle of exploding wasn't super helpful to her. And what we did then with that child, and what is like the next step in the scaffolding, is to help them into what their bodies are telling them. Where do you feel anger? Where do you feel anxiety? Is it a churning in the stomach? Is it a heart rate feeling really fast? Is it heat coming up your neck? Is it becoming sweaty? What are the clues? Because that's a classic fight or flight response. Our body's preparing us for some sort of action. So we have physiological responses that are consistent. We may tune more or less into some than others, right? So what does your chest feel like? Your face, your legs, your hands? What are you thinking if they're a bit older and they can think about their own thinking? So for our friend who I started speaking about before, this was her body map. So she would get this sort of stiffness and heat all over. She would stomp her feet. She would say and think, this is so unfair. And, she would yell as well. So these were her clues, right? And then you sort of want to sequence them. So what comes first? What are the small, medium, and big clues? So again, this will be different for different people. This was for what I sort of have already showed you for this particular little girl. But it's going to be different for different people, right? Different clues at different levels will give us that insight. And then the last thing we'll talk about before we end today is this idea of, okay, so we know what we're feeling. We can put a label on it. We're starting to become attuned to when we are on the cusp of having a big feeling. We're at level 1, we're at level 2, and level 3, we're done. How do we stop moving through the levels, getting to level 3? What are the types of strategies we could do to help ourselves regulate? So we do, you might introduce a classic stop, think, do, or stop, breathe, think, however you want to say it. But basically, how do we circuit break this escalation, I guess, into a level 3 feeling or a red zone feeling, however you want to call it. And I think the stopping and then the thinking, like, how am I feeling? What am I feeling here? We need to have the do part of, okay, what do I do about it? What do I do about the feeling? And maybe like the stopping and the breathing either isn't enough, or so you need to do something then, or you need a completely different type of strategy. Because I think the stopping and the breathing isn't necessarily the be all and end all. Maybe you need more of a cognitive strategy where this is what I do. Like, this is I really engage with my either my angry or my anxious thoughts, and I go, okay, what is the likelihood that this outcome, if I'm anxious, because that's the feeling that I experience the most, what's the likelihood that this outcome it's word between my mind is going to happen? Okay, if it did happen, what would be the cost? Could I deal with it? And so I really engage with the content of my worries or my anxieties. Same with anger. Anger is usually driven by thoughts around, this is so unfair, there's an injustice here. Sometimes it's like, yeah, it's injustice, it shouldn't have happened that way. Is there another way of thinking about it? What was the other person's motivation? Is it helpful for me to keep almost sitting and admiring the problem, sitting at the feet of the problem and admiring it? Do I need to sort of diffuse from my thoughts? So all of those are very cognitive strategies. Engaging with the thoughts, or being distracted from the thoughts. I'll often listen to a podcast to sort of just shift my mind away to get me out of that rut, right? So that works for some people. And obviously for kids, we need to distill it down into more, developmentally appropriate ways. You're a thought detective, you're detecting worry thoughts, or angry thoughts, or, what type of, mindfulness type of strategies. You've got a big elephant that's stepping on your chest, so make sure your chest is really strong to sort of get them sort of grounded in their bodies, all of that sort of thing. But then other people really benefit from more doing or behavioral strategies. The physical exercise that we walk, the walk we spoke about, it could be quite high intensity, or it could be more sort of the muscle relaxation and calming activities, and then obviously the breathing as well. But the breathing, it's one strategy in what could be a number, right? So that's what I always like. The toolboxes are so personal, and I think for us, we all have different things in our toolboxes, and those strategies will work when we're at different levels of a feeling. And kids need help figuring out what's in their toolbox and what's going to help them. The number of kids who've come at me and been like, I am not stopping, I'm not breathing, I'm not doing, I hate it, I hate it, I hate it. That's a really common reaction. So we need to sort of work with them to figure out what's going to be motivating and effective, right? And this is sort of just demonstrating that different strategies may help at different levels of a feeling, different intensities of a feeling, and that'll be different for different people. These were some of the strategies that this little girl came up with: walking the dog, writing a diary, talking to friends, going noodle, reading a book. And then the last thing I'll talk about, because I'm aware we're over time, is just some of these sort of tips and tricks. And one I've already mentioned, that we really need to individualize it, and we really need to practice it, which is one of the things that we've spoken about. It's almost like the conditioned, you almost need to have the learning experience of this does end. The consequences of this cool down, of this stopping and this breathing, you need to have multiple learning experiences of that for that to start being more reinforcing than kicking off and the immediate sort of gratification or reinforcement that lashing out brings you. So it is practice in a lot of ways. We also need to time it though, because if a kid's already level 3 hot zone, red zone, it's not going to be effective. They're in hot brain. They don't have the capacity to draw on some of the experiences or the learning that they've already had about cool down. So we only want to prompt the skills if the student's in a manageable state and able to practice the strategy. We also want to try and get in before the escalation happens, which means we have to be quite attuned to individual triggers and cues, right? We want to model emotional regulation attempts and talk about that out loud. And critically, we want to give these kids the experience of using these strategies when they're calm. So much easier to do something once you've already done it once. And so the best way to go about that is to practice in a really low stakes situation. And crucially, we need to give them some sort of reinforcing, whether that's for the child, praise and attention, rewards, whatever they're going to experience as reinforcing for attempting to or even being successful at using their skills.